Okay, so I'm going to be talking about ethics, launching our new series on ethics, first of all. And the title I've given just to this little talk is Feeling Responsible, just as an introduction to the overall theme of this second series, which will be on ethics, and then moving on to politics and practical ethics. So it will be obviously not just about ethics, but about the middle way applied to ethics specifically. And ethics have been a central interest, concern of mine in relation to the middle way from the beginning, really. So when I started my work on the middle way more than 20 years ago now, it started with a PhD thesis on ethics. So as far as I'm concerned, really, the middle way is ethics, and ethics is the middle way. But there is a narrower and broader way of talking about ethics. So ethics can be seen as sort of practice in general, because it's ethically good to practice along the middle way. But it's also got a narrower sense, which is focused on judgments about how to act, really, as opposed to other things we might make judgments about, like how things are in the background. So, yeah, I think in order to apply the middle way to ethics, or to do ethics in a middle way way, it's all really about closing the gap between the experience of where we are and our beliefs about what we should be doing, our beliefs about where we should get to. So there's this process of navigation and of integration as well, obviously, as in the middle way in general. But we're thinking about what that means in specifically ethical terms. So my title, Feeling Responsible, is intended to sort of ground us on experience, really. So I think that's a good point to start when thinking about how to apply the middle way to ethics with ethical experience. So ethical experience can often take the form of a feeling of responsibility in our bodies, almost. So not just in our heads, almost, but our whole being is I think has an ethical aspect to it. So that's the starting point for growth in a way. Now that starting point might consist of a number of ethical motives, really, and they may come from or be explained in terms of a number of different factors. So obviously, one thing that springs to people's minds often is empathy. So there's a whole approach to ethics which might even equate it with empathy in some cases, though I think there's more to it than just empathy. But obviously, a bit of oxytocin going around the system, making us feel warm feelings for others, doesn't do any harm as a starting point. But that's largely got not so much to do with ethical practice as what's going on in our bodies for all sorts of other reasons. We may also have other kind of instinctual responses, like a feeling of responsibility for our children. But also it may may be more than just genetically programmed. It may be part of our social experience from an early age. So if you think about something like a sense of justice, that's probably got a lot to do with our relationship with siblings when we were very young, in many cases. The sort of sense of things ought to be fair, which we then develop and apply in other ways. Or the desire for freedom that we get from moving away from our parents. So the very starting points, reasons why we might feel as we do. We might feel responsible. But that's just a starting condition. And I don't suggest that we stop there. And that's why I'm dissatisfied with the approach to ethics of those who assume we should stop there, that that's what ethics is. So ethics isn't just a description of how we would feel anyway. It's a prescription. It's suggesting how we should act, but then there's also this huge danger in the prescription, obviously, of just idealizing. So I prefer to think of ethical practice as a stretch. I think the word stretch is really useful here in thinking about it. So we start off from where we are, and we engage with the meaning of wider ethical claims without adopting them as absolute beliefs, but nevertheless having a sense of them being important, and being important as something meaningful that we can relate to and be inspired by. So another way of putting that would be that more absolute ideas about ethics are archetypes. They can be sources of inspiration for us. So these wider ethical claims are everywhere, you know, in classic ways of expressing ethics in and outside religion, but also in other places where they can be disguised, you know, so wherever people talk about should or good or right or wrong, or even kind of diluted prescriptive terms like appropriate, you know, that's kind of trying to make it more accessible, digestible, but you know, it's still got a prescriptive edge to it, hasn't it? Is that appropriate? Sometimes ethical claims come in the guise of professionalism, say, or social convention, respect, manners, prudence, self-discipline, self-development. All of those sorts of things might have oughts in them that we might be told, or we might encounter ideals about how we should be in these respects, and we may feel that we fall short of them. Or of course we might be told by religion, or we might be encounter in a political or philosophical context these sort of ideals about how we should be, how we should act. So these ethical claims are always making demands of us, and quite often, typically, they are absolute demands. So they tend to start from beyond our experience and tell us we should act in such and such a way. I mean, the kind of classic example of that, which I gave on the video about responsibility that some of you may have watched, is Jesus telling the young man to go and sell all you have and give all your money to the poor, which is a pretty tall order when you think about it. To just psychologically to let go of this wealth that we've spent all our lives identifying with, we can't just do that. I don't think it's psychologically realistic. But absolute ethics doesn't tend to take into account psychology most of the time. It just gives us an absolute, this is what you should do, regardless of the actual psychological difficulties in doing it. So that's why I think the middle way is a much more realistic way of approaching ethics, without entirely discounting that ideal. So absolute ethics just by itself, I think, is institutionalized failure, really. We don't really expect people to do what they should do in those terms. Whether it's according to some universal philosophy or even according to group ethics, what your country really expects of you, say, or your profession or something. And quite often it turns into what in modern times has come to be called virtue signaling, which is, I think, a useful term in some ways, but it also has a lot of dangers. So it's become quite a popular term in some ways. So virtue signaling is making moral claims which are mainly significant because they're a social sign to other people, rather than actually likely to change anything. So moralizing, being holier than thou. Sometimes political correctness can be a bit like this, at its worst anyway. But of course, the danger there, if you know, when you talk about virtue signaling, I think sometimes that can cynically undermine people who are actually trying to be ethical. So I think we need to be careful in the use of that term, but it does give you an idea of what it's like when people make absolute ethical claims without them being related to practice, really. So absolute ethics tends to hold people responsible rather than connecting to their feeling of responsibility. And you can hold people responsible in all sorts of ways, but a classic example of that, which is discussed, I think in one of the podcasts Barry did with John Ronson, is public shaming. So this takes place on social media, for example, where some sort of absolute moral imperative is assumed and somebody's assumed to have clearly broken it. They've done something bad or they've been bad in some way. And it's also assumed that it's a good idea to tell everyone about this. Yeah, so there's obviously something in us which latches onto this readily, but it's an absolutization. I think it's disconnected from helpful ethical practice where we stretch ourselves and actually change something. I mean, holding people responsible is also a necessary social mechanism. Obviously, within any kind of institution, for example, you know, people need to be held responsible for their duties and their jobs, say. There's legal, you know, holding people responsible legally. But I'd suggest that we try and distinguish that from ethics as such. So if ethics is a stretch, is a practice for us, then it's good to distinguish that from an absolute requirement of the kind that we might have to use in a legal framework. But the danger is often that a legalistic model is used for ethical judgment, which tends to create absolutization. And usually that goes with the attribution either of total responsibility or of no responsibility, which tend to go with free will and determinism beliefs. So the assumption that either somebody has completely responsible for what they did and it's bad, and that goes with it with a set of biases, or similarly often for ourselves, we might well say, oh, well, assume we're not responsible for something actually that we did contribute to. So incrementality is really important here to try and diffuse this sort of absoluteness of holding people responsible. But the practice of ethics in the middle way, I think, involves starting with a sense of responsibility and being aware of how we feel responsible, and then trying to push that slightly beyond where we are, in accordance with, well, perhaps you could call it a voice of conscience, although there's different ways of interpreting that term. I think a voice of conscience might mean different possibilities, a sort of moral provisionality, a way of thinking a bit further about how we could act beyond our usual habits. So if we reconsider our habitual assumptions, then we may find ways of stretching our sense of what we're responsible for a bit more. So that's not the same as the guilty conscience, which, you know, again, some degree of guilt can be helpful if it helps us to reflect on what we've done when we've made mistakes, but very often that's absolutized as well. We take we rely on hindsight and we assume that we did something totally wrong, regardless of the circumstances, for example. So incrementality is really important here for sticking with our experience and pushing it a bit, That's a matter of degree. We can be slightly more responsible than we were before, without feeling that we have to completely apply this absolute total or zero responsibility which society tends to push on us according to the rules. And that's a major reason for that is that we can't instantaneously change our psychology. So that also suggests, of course, that we shouldn't try to impose these absolute moral expectations on others either, which would fit, a reasonable sort of learning framework. If we can understand that others have to learn to fulfill their responsibilities, then that's got to be a gradual process. So the ways we can stretch ourselves or stretch our sense of responsibility might mean, in terms of the people to whom we feel responsible, towards whom we feel responsible. So, for example, it may be quite difficult to do what some utilitarians think we should do, which is to feel responsible for a starving person on the other side of the world. It's very hard for such a person not to be an abstraction, really. Though if you see them on video, of course, that may change that a bit. But yeah, it's very hard to feel like that sort of sense of responsibility for someone who isn't very immediate to you and in your experience. But we can widen who we feel responsible for within the people that we encounter in some way or another. We can also widen our sense of aspects of our own or others' lives that we're responsible for. So we start looking at different aspects of our lives that perhaps we neglected before. Maybe we didn't think enough about our health, for example, and we start doing so. And maybe thinking longer term. So if you think of the saying that you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, but teach a man to fish, then you support him for a lifetime. So you help him support himself for a lifetime. Now, there may be issues with fishing there, but the underlying point is obviously about sustainability and supporting people and doing things for themselves. So that's also like an extension of responsibility into looking ahead for what people really need in the long term, and integrating understanding with that sense of responsibility. So basically, responsibility meshes with all other aspects of practice. I think you can't really separate responsibility from understanding of others and understanding of the wider conditions that we live in. So understanding how we should understand the facts, is often completely inseparable from our ethical motives. And obviously, a good example of that is climate change. That an understanding of what climate change is happening, what the scientific evidence is pretty inseparable from having a sense of responsibility about it, or how we can contribute to addressing it. So ethics is an aspect of practice, and in a sense, it is practice. Okay, so that's just like a starting point, I think, or an overview of how I want to approach ethics over the next few weeks. So I'll be talking in the next few sessions. I'll be talking more about evil and about dealing with rules and goals and virtues, which are different aspects of how we make judgments about ethics. But hopefully that's a starting point to start considering, particularly our own sense of what we feel responsible about and what we think the middle way has to do with our sense of responsibility. So I'll leave it there for now then, and see if you've got any questions or comments. Mark?
Um, I'm wondering, you mentioned the role of guilt in a religious sense. And I've been thinking about in Christianity the notion of original sin, that we're all guilty from the beginning, which can increase a sense of responsibility to make up for that, um, and gratitude if one believes that one's saved through God's grace. And different forms of Christianity emphasize good works, charity, along with getting grace from God or not. But it also seems to set up a sense of obligation or debt that is very personal, very individual. Um, it's a way of explaining, I guess, going back to St. Augustine, a way of explaining how humans get so off track, do terrible things, blaming that on our original parents back to Adam and Eve. But it's also a way, I think, of controlling people's framework for understanding responsibility. So, how do you see the middle way negotiating or renegotiating the psychology of that, especially in more Western cultures where individuality is emphasized?
I mean, I guess my feeling about the original sin doctrine, or the sort of insight that might be connected with it, is to do with imperfection, really, that we can't be divine, and we can't be perfect in meeting our expectations and ideals. So if there's something useful about the Christian ideal of idea of sinfulness, that seems to be it to me. But of course, there's all sorts of psychologically damaging stuff which has accrued to that, which I think particularly people who have had a Catholic background may be keen to talk about. Yeah, what's often termed irrational guilt, but you can talk in terms of also of the absolutizing of guilt, and a sense of having done something totally wrong, as it were, according to God. Yeah, so I guess that's where I stand in terms of the Augustinian legacy. I suppose that it's there were things you can get out of it, but on the whole, the way it's been interpreted doesn't seem to me that helpful. But it sounds as though you have a slightly more positive view of it, Mark.
Well, I grew up with a more positive view of it, but I'm
Right.
starting to question that,
Right.
especially as I make comparison with Buddhism or Chinese culture for its positive and negative aspects, East Asian culture more generally, which emphasizes relational responsibility more than individual, or even a sense of individual judgment. So, that can seem kind of odd, or even against a universal notion of human rights for many of us. On the other hand, it's an emphasis on the relational responsibility beyond one's self-interest that I think Buddhism helps to cultivate also, because there's not just the individual path to enlightenment through meditation and improved behavior. And it is for one's own benefit, but it's also the notion of compassion, that selfishness is the main obstacle, not original sin, but one's current attachments. So I'm finding that more useful, and yet I still have, either it's the Catholic guilt or it's an increased sense of responsibility through Buddhist compassion, that I'm often angry at myself or frustrated or depressed the more I listen to the news, like you mentioned with recent developments in the US, the more I realize how little I am doing. And then I fall back into, well, what can I do? But that sense of, compassion, and yet inability to make much difference, is very frustrating and even kind of depressing. So the older Christian sense of that, you know, you're supposed to do charitable acts, especially through your church community, but it's up to God to solve the ultimate problems. That can be very reassuring, especially if you have the rituals of the church, or if you're Protestant, you have a, you know, belief in being born again, so that you have your individual salvation, and it's up to God to fix the bigger problems.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But obviously, the issues here, I think, with the dependency on deontology or rule morality in Christian tradition as well. I mean, as in the other monotheistic traditions as well. That very often tends to leave us with a sort of an absolute set of expectations about how it should be, and discourage incrementality of a kind that helps us find a balance in our actual practice, our way of engaging with these things. Yeah, but we'll talk more about that when we'll have a talk on rules, and we'll go into that more. Any other thoughts from anyone else? Bridget.
Well, I was thinking about responsibility, and I cannot see it outside of relationship. It's a bit of a tautological comment, obvious, but the question I often ask myself is, to whom am I responsible? In the light that someone just the other side of the world, we've been a colonizing force. For what am I responsible? To whom am I responsible? And then it brings me to the collective. For what are we responsible? We love rescuing, and we love to play, in a way, the card of being the good. I mean, US aid, for example, in Zimbabwe, the yellow maize came in, and you can't help but wonder some of the motivations behind that, though we were grateful for it in the drought. But I often wonder that, to whom am I responsible? And I get tongue-tied with it. So I'm not sure quite how you feel about it.
Well, potentially, I suppose I feel that's anybody, but it's a question of what you can actually manage. It's a crucial thing. So with this temptation we have to absolutize our sense of responsibility, we might feel we're responsible to everyone, but it's not feasible to be responsible to everyone. So it's better to be responsible to someone rather than to set out to be responsible to everyone and fail. But maybe that's slightly different from the question you seem to be starting with, which was more about we being responsible, which I think is another question, isn't it? So that's more of a corporate or organizational question. So for example, is Britain responsible for the impact of the British slave trade on black people in the past, or something like this? Should it make restitutions for slavery or something? Those are questions about institutions or which involve formal decision making.
Yes, I wouldn't put it in a dualistic form. Are we responsible? But for what are we responsible? In what way are we responsible? There'll be that kind of is much more of a middle way question.
Yeah.
In what way, as Quakers, we're asking that question? In what way were we involved? We didn't have clean hands, even though we hold a position of peace and anti-slavery. Doesn't mean it. So, in what way are we responsible, rather than are we?
I think you can only start answering that by adopting an incremental approach. So we can't have a total answer to such questions, but we can start with how we feel, and then try to engage with different ways that we might be responsible. I mean, I think that's what would or might be the way to prevent that question becoming a kind of institutionalized failure. In that again, just go around in a circle, feeling ourselves to be absolutely responsible and not being, which as humans we're likely to end up in. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, maybe any final questions or thought? Anyone else? No? Okay, well, if there isn't, then I'll stop the recording there.